This video shares how I've been using compost wrong, and are we maybe misunderstanding the term bare soil? Hello and a very warm welcome back to the garden. Now for many years, I would always mulch my beds with compost at the end of the growing season for winter. That stops now. Why? Well, I've decided to make a whole video to explain. So this decision comes after a lot of small things building up. And the thing which broke the camel's back was just how wet it was last year. This video is very much focused on the annual side of vegetable gardening. So if you're growing annual plants, for example, this radish, compost is essential for it. It doesn't matter so much with perennials. But what I realised is that I just did not respect or appreciate compost enough. And it's funny with gardening because sometimes you get in the habit of doing the same thing because it's the done thing and you never really question why. And this stuff here, this was my hotbed this year and it is absolutely full of high quality compost. Now, I would go as far to say that this area in front of me, apart from the two other compost bins, is the most valuable square metre that I have in this garden, because the amount of compost here, the amount of food that I can grow from this compost is huge. And the thing that I suddenly realised is my last average frost date is mid-May. And so what it means is I'm not really planting crops out into my beds until around mid-May. And I felt that putting this amazing, beautiful quality compost, like I used to do, on beds in October, November and December, to then have 4, 5 or 6 months of rain, of frost, and it's just this thin little layer beating down on it, I don't think that that's going to be very good for the compost, and I do feel it will actually lose a lot of its properties. And there's kind of this thing, I think there's a bit of a difference between UK gardeners and maybe US gardeners, and this is something that I remember having a chat with Joshua Sparks. It just sometimes things spark a thought, no pun intended. Well, it actually was intended, but it kind of sparks this thought, and he said that their compost is treated like the most precious thing. You're just putting little bits of compost over it because it is so precious. Whereas here in the UK, we're nah, whatever, we'll stick 2 or 3 inches of compost on, and it's kind of one of the biggest things holding people back from being self-sufficient. And then I thought, you know what, I am done with putting this very precious resource on the beds to get what could essentially happen over those 4 or 5 months. Could have over a metre worth of rain, over 3 foot of rain equivalent, going down onto that compost. And it just, I just like my compost too much. I respect it too much. It's kind of I don't know, getting, sending off your best quality potatoes to go to McDonald's or something. It just doesn't make any logical sense, right? So I've changed my way. I am putting compost down on my beds, but I'm not doing it over winter. I'm doing some other things instead. The first thing is that I just don't care as much. Part of me, I don't know why, but part of me, if I had to make one extreme version or decision compared to another, part of me would rather not mulch my beds with any compost, leave it bare, and then put that fresh compost down that I've protected in a larger vat or tank or compost bin, protected from the elements, to then put that down in March. I think we very much underestimate how powerful nature is and how quickly it can rebound. And so I would rather not do anything, keep my compost, make more compost, keep my compost, and then place it down at the start of the growing season, and maybe use an amendment like Jadam microbial solution just to help kickstart that biology. I think I'd rather do that than put down the compost at the end of the growing season. If it was between the two, that's kind of where my thinking is at. I know it feels like I would never have expected older me around 3 years ago to say that, but it kind of makes sense. But as you can see, I'm not leaving it bare, because we all know that bare soil isn't really the ideal situation. And so I want to talk around some of the strategies and things that I'm doing instead. A really important thing for me is to look at what resources are available that I don't have to buy, because I want my garden to be resilient as possible. These leaves are a perfect example of that. These leaves have been placed down to mulch this bed in a polytunnel. A really important thing to bear in mind with any kind of undercover growing is to remember it doesn't rain. So because it doesn't rain inside, I would be more inclined to put down my compost, but still I'm putting it out, and if I'm not growing anything in it, it's kind of just sitting there on the surface. And so what I would maybe do instead is mulch with compost and then mulch with leaves on top. In this case, it's just putting the leaves down just to protect. They'll start to break down. At the start of spring, I will rake off whatever leaf matter is left, then incorporate a little bit of compost. But autumn leaves are fantastic. My preference though for undercover growing spaces is to grow things in them all over winter, because when we say like bare soil, you don't want to have bare soil, it's not, to me, that's not just soil that is bare and hasn't been mulched. It is soil that is bare of living plants. If you want healthy living soil, in conjunction with that, you've got to have plants and living roots in the ground. Otherwise, if this was just mulched like the other beds with the autumn leaves, it's still, I would say, bare, but it's not like the worst form of bare that can be eroded, if that makes sense. So here in this polytunnel, I've got all sorts of things happening, and there's some Cape gooseberries here which are doing quite nicely. Now if these die because of a cold snap, I can just chop and drop and mulch, and I've got lots of seedlings in pots that I can bring out and put here in the bed. I will also move plants from outside into the bed. So I'll show you an example in a second, but just around here I've got all sorts of things like kohlrabi and radish and a few different kind of things like beetroot and chard and a few different herbs. So even if I'm not going to harvest too much, it is that living soil. What my plan will then to be is to chop and drop it quite finely around February, then add a bit of compost, and then that is going to be absolutely beautiful to plant my tomatoes in again next year. So this is a south-facing boundary, and it's lovely. It feels like nice and warm. I'm very excited because this is a Japanese wineberry that I'm going to train against, and there's some goji there as well. And in front of it, instead of just mulching, because I grew a bunch of squash here this year, this is like, we got loads of squash. And it is very fertile underneath. It's still very fertile. And so did the last grass cut of the season, and instead of putting down the compost, I put down this grass, and this will break down pretty well. In fact, this will probably mostly be broken down by the start of the next growing season, because what happens is things are going to decompose much faster if they're in contact with soil. And as well, because it's grass clippings, I don't want a big, thick layer. And so grass provides a huge amount of fertility. I honestly believe that you could grow a really productive garden having grass as the only input, i.e. grass compost over time, grass mulch, and grass liquid feed, even for things like tomatoes. Because I have lots of grass, I'm going to utilise the resources that I have available to me, and that is why it's not just this bed, but other beds are being mulched with grass clippings. And the other lovely thing is, when the rain comes down, the rain will come and penetrate slowly rather than kind of washing away any of the compost, so it slows down the rainfall. And the other thing is that mulch, it acts as an insulation. So it's going to help protect the soil underneath from those really cold temperatures. Unlike compost, if you've just got a layer of compost over the top, it's going to very much be going through that freeze-thaw process, which really isn't going to help the biological life that homemade compost is so full of. Sticking with the theme of living roots in the soil, one of the things that you can do to help keep your soil nice and healthy over winter is just to grow a greater proportion of either biannual crops. For example, actually this chard here is going to stay in all over winter, and also your hardy winter crops, which also in this case happens to be a biannual, which are leeks. So instead of trying to grow all of your garden to then try and preserve and store whatever you can by October, which takes up a lot of time, what I try and do is grow as many winter vegetables as possible, so I don't have to spend as much time over summer and autumn preserving stuff. and then over winter I can just come out and harvest things, which is quite nice. And the other thing that I'm doing here was I'm allowing a few weeds to grow and see what happens. And I've actually got some parsley that's grown up and around it. And the idea with weeds as well, they are another form of living plant matter. And so I am experimenting with some beds where I'm allowing weeds to grow over winter, and then I might just lightly cultivate them, like mix them up, chop them up into the top layer, and then add compost over the top. I've got no problem with causing soil disturbance on the top, maybe like 2 or 3 inches, because again, nature bounces back very quickly, and where you find annuals in nature is in disturbed soil. So yeah, there's all of these really interesting things, and it's just to try and further take myself away from being so reliant on compost, and to show you that you don't have to rely on so much compost, and there's so many other ways that we can grow food, and we can grow a lot of food and still have healthy soil. And of course, another way to get living roots in your soil over winter is to plant cover crops, and this is something that I'm always experimenting with, but the ones that kind of work the best for me are things like field beans, just because they're hardier, but growing things like mustard or phacelia and then letting them die through the hard frosts, and then they can provide a nice mulch over winter. Another method that's kind of related to it, but I thought I might as well share because it might be useful, but I am gradually adding activated biochar that I've made myself into all of the beds in the garden. Currently the beds in the polytunnel, I wanted to prioritise the polytunnel beds first. Those are filled with activated biochar. It's around a 5 to 10% volume ratio in the soil, and 2 beds outside. I'm in front of one of the beds here, which I put activated biochar as well, right at the start of the growing season, and it's one of the additional methods or strategies that I'm using to continue to build up and improve how kind of healthy and vibrant the soil is. My dream scenario as a vegetable gardener is that I don't need to buy in any compost whatsoever. Now, last year this was a self-sufficiency garden, and it achieved that. I produced more than enough compost. I've got more compost en route. I'm using all of these different styles of mulching, and it's really helping. The only thing that I do get in a bit of compost is for raising of seedlings, but next year I'm going to be doing a lot more of my own seed sowing mixes, which is exciting. But the sheer dependence on compost is holding back so many gardeners that in my upcoming book, The Permaculture Garden, I have a whole chapter dedicated about how to kind of take back control and create your own compost in your garden, but also different strategies to lower the needs. For example, if you're transplanting, just put compost at the bottom of the transplanting hole, or look at growing more perennials instead, which is another factor that really helps out in this garden.